state of affairs, commonly known as state capture, has seen a small clique of the elite form a state parallel to the constitutional state, all with the aim of plundering public resources. Africog says that the corrupt elite have over time managed to sanitize their ill-gotten wealth and in the process also compromised institutions tasked with maintaining the moral fabric of the society. A case in point is the huge donation made to churches and other organizations, all in the name of charity, but which are a bait and a switch ploy.
And then the capture of the criminal justice system so that people can get away with it. So once you capture the public finance system, you capture the cow so that you're milking it, and then you make sure that you capture the cops so that you can continue milking the cow and nothing happens to you.
And while the report notes that the efforts by the government to fight corruption are worth celebrating, it is all but a cosmetic exercise aimed at fighting political wars and sanitizing the plunder by the rich. The government in most cases also resorts to ineffective techniques such as the formation of commissions of inquiry, corrupting institutions and other measures, all aimed at blocking prosecutions. Politics and corruption have also become one, meaning that any attempts to persecute and punish ills committed by others are crippled. The whole objective of this capture, says Africog, is to amass resources, manipulate systems, rig elections, all with the intention of maintaining power for the benefit of the few.
Kenya has got the most sophisticated legal and institutional infrastructure for fighting corruption in Africa. So the idea that we can reform, tinker an institution here and there to fix this problem, I think we accept it's over. And it's now a political problem.
All said and done, the report concludes that the war against corruption will only be won through a non-partisan and collaborative effort aimed at strengthening independent institutions in government. Silas Apollo, NTV.
As we informed you at the top of the hour, the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission officers have raided the homes of Kiambu Governor Ferdinand Waititu. Those are his garden estate home and his Runda home. We did promise you that we have pictures of the raid, and here are those pictures. Well, according to the Daily Nation, tens of officers arrived at his residences a few minutes after 5 a.m. and started a search for files and documents. The outspoken governor, popularly known as Baba Yao, is under the EACC spotlight of alleged corruption in a number of his county programs, including his Car Sober program, which Charity Mwangi reported on a few weeks ago, and which was aimed at rehabilitating alcoholics. Sources told the Nation that 15 other officials of the county government are targeted in the ongoing investigations. The Kiambu governor, who has been in the news recently over questionable expenditure at the county in the last financial year, is facing allegations of procurement irregularities and unexplained expenditure. Those pictures you're seeing on your screens are of a raid by Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission detectives on the Kiambu Governor Ferdinand Waititu's homes. They've raided his Runda home as well as his garden estate home. We have Kennedy Mureithi, who is on location and whom we'll be speaking to shortly for the latest on the raid. But according to the Daily Nation, it took place just a few minutes after 5 a.m. when detectives arrived on the two premises and started cutting away files and documents. The detectives who are investigating alleged corruption in the county that borders the capital, Nairobi, and are searching for documents relating to contracts issued by Waititu's administration. As you'll recall, the governor was in the spotlight recently for suspect expenditure when he appeared before the Senate's County Public Funds and Investments Committee. As I said, Kennedy Muriithi will be speaking to us shortly and bring us the latest on that particular raid. But if you'll recall, Muthomi Njuki, who's the Tharaka Nithi governor, is also under investigation over the cost of an incinerator which was valued at 4 million shillings, but which the county paid much more for. The other governor, who is currently being investigated as well, is the Murang'a governor, Wairia, over the controversial purchase of a 10-acre piece of land at over 300 million shillings. Staying with matters corruption, one of the main functions of a government is to ensure that public funds are well utilized for the benefit of citizens. In Kenya, however, these very funds continue to be misused and misappropriated as the corruption train wreaks havoc on the country's economy. This despite repeated promises of action to stem the bleeding. NTV's Brenda Wanga reports on the web of corruption and how it seems to have looped in just about all arms of government.
First, the confession. Then, the numerous promises to fix this problem, the latest coming just early this week.
It will be difficult, it will be noisy, but it will happen. It will happen. It will happen because there's no going back, and this is an agenda I just want to be very, very, very clear about.
While the president's intentions to eradicate or significantly reduce the alarming levels of graft in the country as the key legacy of his administration are well documented, the actual work of achieving this remains a mirage.
They do not address the real problem. The real problem is the union of corruption and politics.
Indeed, the tentacles of the monster that is corruption spread wide and far, encompassing all arms of government.
Is a cabal of insiders who capture the state, and principally, not all of the state, principally the presidency, treasury, and the security. Because that's all you need to capture a state. Capture power, capture money, and capture intelligence.
The executive has seen its members, at least 10 cabinet secretaries, face investigations over their possible involvement in a number of scandals running into billions of shillings in the Aror and Kamwerere dams, as well as the Ruaraka land scandals.
Governor.
That same grid has moved to the counties, where governors have been arraigned in court to answer to misappropriation of county funds and abuse of power charges.
Order number 13.
Even the legislature that is expected to create laws that will protect the public funds have found themselves on the receiving end of public anger over the award of hefty allowances, despite the opposition from the Salaries and Remuneration Commission. The courts haven't been spared this problem either. At the Apex Court, the Deputy Chief Justice is fighting to save her job and her reputation after she was charged on graft-related cases. 3 judges are also under investigation for abusing their powers while in office. When it isn't the bench, it is the officers in the judiciary system who have been accused of subverting the course of justice. Only last month, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions had to dismiss its officers for presenting to court a weekend case against an advocate accused of killing his son. The handling of Asa Nyakundi's case was just a case in point of how deep the corruption networks seem to have infiltrated the corridors of justice. The impunity that edges on corruption going as far into the bodies charged with fighting it. The Directorate of Criminal Investigations saw its 2 senior officers arrested for soliciting bribes from foreigners late last year, and surprisingly, their colleagues staged the daring rescue of the officers from a police station in Kabete, perhaps the perfect illustration of just how convoluted this war against corruption in the country has become. Brenda Wanga, NTV.
In just the past 3 months, the country has been treated to a myriad of cases of fake products ranging from foodstuff, money, detergents, and now gold, to name just but a few. This comes after a longer, disturbing trail of counterfeit and contraband goods that make their way not only into the country but to Wanjiku's home. This underscores the January 2016 statement by then Chief Justice Willy Mutunga that Kenya is running a bandit economy. The situation exposes Kenya as a hub of fakes, and Jane Goi takes a real look at what is just a drop in the ocean of a bigger problem.
2019. The Director of Criminal Investigations, George Kinoti, reported to the country that a whopping 2 billion shillings in fake US dollars had been found stashed in a private safe deposit box by a client at Barclays Bank, Queensway branch. When the news broke, it broke another code of confidence in the country's integrity. Questions arose. Just how could that much fake currency find its way into such an esteemed financial institution and sit pretty all the while? How many other banks, trusted as they are, have also been infiltrated by different tentacles of impunity? How much in terms of fake currency could be circulating in the economy?
I still believe that we have those particular issues of cartels and the corruption.
Just under a month earlier, on 27 February, police officers from the Special Crimes Prevention Unit seized a cache of largely fake foreign cash amounting to 32 billion shillings in a residential house in Ruiru town. On 1st October 2018, another cache of 1 billion shillings of fake foreign currency was recovered in Westlands, Nairobi. In October 2016, 2 suspects were arrested at the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport with 276 million euros in fake notes on transit to Dubai. A chain of events that continues to raise concerns whether Kenya could be turning into a base for transitional fake cash cartels. The fake business is not exclusive to the cash cartels. In the month of May, the Anti-Counterfeit Agency announced it had confiscated goods worth 125 million shillings in just 1 month, goods that were either fake or imported irregularly. Contraband and expired rice was recently nabbed in Nairobi's Kariobangi area. In the same month, DCI detectives arrested 15 suspects linked to a fake gold syndicate operating in the country. The suspects were nabbed in a rented house in Nairobi, where consignments bearing Ghanaian custom papers stuffed in metallic boxes whose weight had been altered using cement. The blade of fakes cut into the police service, with examples such as the 2013 incident of a police imposter Joshua Waiganjo, who is currently serving a jail term. Just a few of the many damning cases that could allow former CJ Willy Mutunga to pass for a prophet of sorts, having termed Kenya as a bandit economy. Jane Ngoiri, NTV.
This next story only serves to prove that indeed we are a country of fakes. Jared Otieno and 2 other accused persons in the ongoing fake gold case have been positively identified by foreign nationals as having conned them of millions of shillings. The Directorate of Criminal Investigations believes that the suspects are part of an influential transnational fake gold cartel with root source from DRC and Ghana. NTV's Seth Olale with the latest on the fake gold syndicate.
Barely 24 hours after Jared Kiasa Otieno pleaded not guilty to conspiring to defraud a foreign national 300 million shillings by alleging that he could sell him gold, the suspect faces yet another arrest and prosecution over different cases related to defrauding and suspected dealers millions of shillings. The Directorate of Criminal Investigations has received complaints from a number of foreign nationals who say they have been conned millions of shillings by Jared Otieno and 2 other co-accused persons that are also implicated in the 300 million shillings fake gold case. The 2 are Philip Nation Aroko and Robert Paul Owiti, who both pleaded not guilty after they were charged with conspiracy to defraud Sounthorn Chandvanton, a director of Simuang Group Company, 300 million shillings. Detectives believe Jared, Aroko and Owiti colluded with foreign associates in form of fake gold marketers who were deployed in Ghana, Congo, neighboring Uganda and Kenya and booked in expensive hotels. 2 Chad nationals by the name of Abuma Famous and Salim Ali Abubakar together with a Congolese national by the name Albert Likole Lokunda, who were among the 15 suspects arrested with fake gold consignment by DCI detectives in a house along Kaputei Road in Valley Arcade, are suspected to be part of the transnational fake gold cartel. The fake gold consignment had Ghanaian custom papers stuffed in metallic boxes with their weight altered using cement and mallets. Investigations so far have also established that the house where the 15 suspects were arrested was being used to lure innocent foreign gold buyers who were literally shown gold being smelted to make bars ready for export. Intelligence sources indicate that the cartel has been colluding with a number of members of parliament, rogue police officers, the judiciary, immigration staff at Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, and some bankers to defraud foreign unsuspecting clans millions of shillings. The large consignment of fake gold seized by the police in recent months are proof that Nairobi has turned into a base for transnational fake gold cartels. Jared Kiasa Otieno, Philip Nashon Aroko, and Robert Paul Owiti, together with other accused persons in the 300 million shillings fake gold case, will appear in court on Monday to hear the ruling on their bail application. Seth Olale, NTV.
Leader of the majority in the National Assembly, Aden Duale, says there is no impeachment process against Interior Cabinet Secretary Fred Matiang'i within Parliament. He, however, warned politicians to stop politicizing the war against corruption. Meanwhile, Machakos County Governor Dr. Alfred Mutua says all suspects named in the gold scam should be handed over to the United Arab Emirates for prosecution. He also defended Matiang'i, saying those attempting to implicate him are the ones robbing the country dry.
I really want to advise, beginning with the leader of minority, that we should not politicize. And they're the ones who said, let us not politicize the war against corruption. So again, even them, our free advice is they should not politicize and drag people's names, including that of Minister Matiang'i, to the ongoing the gold scam investigation. Let us give space to the DCI and the Office of the DPP and EACC to function and to exercise their mandate as per the Constitution.
I ask my fellow politicians to leave Dr. Matiang'i alone and to know that mentioning him will not slow down the investigations against some of them. Any persons who are in the investigation and who are suspected to have swindled our friends of the UAE should not be taken by the DCI to be charged here. They should be repatriated immediately to Dubai to be tried and when found guilty, jailed in one of their tough jails. At least we know that in Dubai, justice will be served speedily.
Do you agree with him? Do you think those who've been implicated or who are suspects in the most recent fake gold scam involving the UAE should be repatriated? Share your thoughts on @NTV Kenya. The hashtag is either cartel country or NTV today. For 32 years, Isaiah Ochanda has been seeking compensation for an injury that he sustained while on duty in the military. After a lengthy legal battle, he received compensation in 2012, which he's yet to receive. He reads a scandal in the red tape that involves highly ranked officers. Charity Mwangi has the details.
In 1985, Isaiah Ochanda was a talented military man. Aside from his ability in combat, he was also the instructor for the military combat sports team, until May 1987, when tragedy struck.
This accident I got from there when I was coaching the national team that was going for All Africa Games. One of my students was going to fall down. Then when I rushed to help him, I found myself in the hospital. Yes. From the hospital, I was diagnosed that I'm tetraplegic. I was paralyzed from the neck downwards. And I thought they were going to give me my juice as because they retired me on a medical ground. This did not happen. I waited for almost going to a year. And you know the law. If you cannot claim your dues within 1 year, then it is written off.
This marked the start of a nightmare that would have him in and out of court, seeking compensation that was due to him but being withheld by unknown military personnel.
I've tried my best. I've communicated everything that court needs. I've gone through. But the Ministry of Defense is as if they don't want to pay me.
In 2012, Lady Justice Kalpana Rawal would order his full compensation in a ruling that sparked hope for Chanda and his family.
The court gave me 6.5 million for disability and 1 million for suffering. So it's a total of 7.5. Now 7.5, then I was given for 10 years.
They are yet to receive the amount in full. Instead, the military...
We now cross over to the Radisson Blu, where the 2019 Africa Shared Value Summit is taking place.
The bottom 60% is largely composed of black, mixed-race people and Asians who descended from the era of slavery and colonial rule. This bottom 60% controls only 7% of the country's net wealth, and half of the South African population live on less than $5 a day. Ladies and gentlemen, the inequality problems that we face today is not only limited to Africa. As a matter of fact, it's the norm on the global arena. I recently came back from Seattle in Washington State, and to quickly bring this into perspective, Washington State plays home to the headquarters of Microsoft and Starbucks, and is also the home of Boeing, the largest private employer in the state. Washington's state tax system has the dubious distinction, according to some analysts, of being America's most regressive tax regime. Reports compiled by independent analysts shows that poor residents in the state pay 16.8% of family income, while the wealthiest 1%, and let me be clear, these are the wealthiest people in the world, the wealthiest 1% pays 2.4% of their income. The same situation plays out in San Francisco, where there's immense income per capita, but it's virtually impossible to live there because it's so expensive. These statistics, whether out of Nairobi, Johannesburg, or Seattle, are pointing to a grim and a growing reality that the number of economically disenfranchised people is growing rapidly right around the world. And yes, this worsening state of affairs, the growing divide between the haves and the have-nots, is playing in many of the areas where our businesses are thriving and where you and I live. The reality is that our global economy today is broken. Hundreds of millions of people living in extreme poverty while huge rewards go to those at the very top. Many reports show that there are more billionaires than ever before, and their fortunes have grown at record levels. And meanwhile, the world's poorest are getting poorer. Ladies and gentlemen, this state of affairs is not sustainable. Over the long term, business cannot succeed where societies are failing. And the reality is that the existing model of business is not generating enough value to contribute to societal good. As our African economies focus on their growth trajectory from lower to middle-income countries, the question is whether our nations should pursue GDP-driven economic growth or growth that aims to bridge these inequalities. We may ask ourselves, why does this matter to business? Now more than ever, there's a clear call to action to business, that the business of business is no longer business. The Sustainable Development Goals The call for more private sector innovation and the call for businesses to develop products and services that address societal needs has been a constant topic in business leadership discussions. You'll hear more from Mark and other speakers through the next 2 days of the summit about the changing role of business and of business leaders. Issues such as climate change, inequalities, and rights are increasingly becoming fundamental issues that we will have to tackle as the private sector if we're to succeed in the long term. The truth is, no other sector, private, public, or NGO, has the capacity to address the fundamental business and social challenges that we face today. And that is why collaborative and inclusive approaches to business and cross-sectoral partnerships are critical. But this has to be looked at from a business lens for it to make sense over the long term. Ladies and gentlemen, increased inequalities lead to social, political ills, such as increased dissatisfaction, disengagement, migration, sectionalism, clanism, tribalism, and xenophobia, something which is all too true in South Africa today. If not addressed, inequalities will ultimately create a political and a business landscape that will be difficult to reverse. And we see that in the United States today. We see it with the mess that's called Brexit in Britain. Inequalities drive people to engagement in nefarious activities such as trafficking and slavery. The BBC reported not too long ago that there are about 4 to 5 million people living in slavery-type situations around the world today. Let's be clear, that's more slaves than existed before slavery was abolished. Faced with this global challenge of inequality, what should businesses do? I want to propose 4 approaches. The first is we must adopt an inclusive business approach. Let's seriously think about how to create employment for young people, how we can do business with more women-led organizations, and the same for the SME segment. Secondly, we must address corruption. Corruption is a challenge in our country, on the continent, and globally. It's often executed with the concurrence of the private sector. We are the other side of that coin. This scourge, which causes significant hemorrhage to the economy, drives inefficiencies, drives up prices, widens inequality, and deprives governments of revenues that should be used to deliver services. Thirdly, we must be responsible and transparent taxpayers. And I speak as the CEO for the company that is the largest taxpayer in the region. In the last year, we paid to the government of Kenya 98 billion shillings. That's almost $1 billion. And we're proud. Because we believe that it's only by providing an efficient tax net, and it's only by us as the private sector taking a responsible approach to paying taxes that governments are able to provide the services that they are elected to provide. And finally, we have to tackle inequalities in the workplace. As businesses grow, we also need to self-examine how pertinent business questions, such as how we're performing on gender pay gaps, gaps between executive salaries and median salaries, especially now with more transparencies around wealth declarations. I can see my friend and brother, Joshua Igara, and we often sit and muse the first time we announced publicly, voluntarily, our earnings and the ridicule that we faced amongst corporate Kenya. Now, of course, it's obligatory. The next thing we have to start declaring is that pay gap. Today, I believe CEOs around the world, the multiple is about 230, the CEO earns about 237% of the median salary. Is that the right thing? I mean, I speak because I know that my multiple is not the same here in Kenya. But do I earn enough money? Of course I earn enough money. But we have to look at that pay gap. We have to look at the gender pay gap. We have to look at the executive salary and remuneration relative to the median salary. We have to look at pay gaps along racial lines. There's no one sector can do any of this alone, but we have to commit to do our part. The public sector needs to set the enabling environment, while those of us in the private sector need to drive delivery of products and services that will transform society for the better. And civil society has to provide the links to communities and to support accountability right away through the line. When we bring all these players together, we create what I like to call constructive value, which suggests that when you add 1 + 1, you get something which is slightly greater than 2. And the only way to achieve this is by partnering together across sectors and sometimes even across platforms. So what are we at Safaricom doing about all of this? In 2016, we started the process of integrating 9 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals into our core business strategy. We did this because we believe that the SDGs provide the opportunities to really engage in a purpose-driven business, a business that is both sustainable and inclusive. We asked ourselves, what business could we do in the SDGs that will help us to drive inclusive growth? Our 9 priority goals are the goals in health, in education, affordable clean energy, decent work and economic growth, innovation and infrastructure, reducing inequalities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, peace and justice, and of course what I consider to be one of the most important goals, and that is partnerships, goal number 17. We have since then registered a significant impact in transformation through our products in health, in education, in agriculture. Our advocacy and partnerships, of which the sponsorship of this summit is one of them, is now beginning to show some good results. We're advocating around anti-corruption. We're advocating around transparency in taxes. We're advocating around child rights. We're advocating around human rights. What business is it of business to be involved in human rights? We are committed to becoming a net zero carbon emitting company by 2050. And trust me, that's not an easy commitment, because year on year our carbon footprint has been increasing over the past few years. Ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, Mark Kramer will talk about shared value, but unless we can address the context within which businesses operate today, it will be an uphill task to deliver sustainable shared value. We must all rethink our business models and strategies and see how to address growing inequalities. I look forward to hearing about how we can create constructive value across sectors that are very important to our continent: health, agriculture, energy, manufacturing, with a view to ensure that we can drive inclusive growth that bridges the gaps and helps bring down the walls that currently divide our population. I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you.
I know he gave you a lot of food for thought, but please give Bob Colomo a round of applause. Let me just once again repeat our hashtag for today. It's ASVS19, just because I know there's certain items there that you were listening to but wanted to tweet. Mine are: business for business is no longer acceptable. Our global economy is broken. You don't even have to add anything else to that. The world's poorest are getting poorer, and this is unsustainable. And the current model of business for business and not adding value is unacceptable. I need to qualify once again that shared value, and the reason we're here today, is not about PR. This is not about image for our businesses. It's not about philanthropy either. And it's not about CSR. It's not corporate social responsibility. And for those of you who walked in a little late and, Bob was going over his 4, suggested ways to go over this, I feel sorry for you because that was heavy, but it was wonderful. And he did say we need to find ways to make our businesses more inclusive, address corruption, a tough one, responsible and honest taxpayers, and of course, address inequality in the organization. I want to think that in Kenya, we have the big 5, the big three and the big four. I want to talk to you about the big four. Our keynote address speaker will do so. The big five, you know them, it's our animals. Our big three, I think Bob alluded to it, in Nairobi, it's Thika Road, Mombasa Road, and the Kikuyu turnoff on the Southern Bypass. That is big three headache. We also, of course, think about the big three in Africa and like to believe that the place your eyes and ears need to be is Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria. However, when you come to Kenya, we do have the big four. And the big four needs to be understood in the context of shared value, because this conversation does not just happen with private sector, public sector must be involved. So before I actually ask our keynote address speaker to take the podium, I want to give you a chance to understand why he's a champion of the president's big four and why he's keen on their delivery and actualization. It is important that I actually introduce you, including the Kenyans in the room, because if I said I have $200, if you can name them without Googling, none of you can. Go on. I dare you. Double dare you. You can't name them, okay? So why don't you please focus on our screens as I introduce you to the big four. I'll bet you didn't know the big four, now you do. The person who is going to give us our keynote address is a gentleman who, if he had not actually taken up his current role, would be hosting this event passionately, because he gets it. And our keynote address this morning will be delivered by the Kenyan Chief of Staff and Head of the Presidential Delivery Unit, Nzioka Waita.
Good morning, everyone. I can see very many friendly and familiar faces. First, let me thank the organizers of the Shared Value Summit for inviting me here today. I don't usually do these events, but I am an evangelist for the Big Four, and it's my job to engage all stakeholders across the board and educate them as to what the Big Four is all about and how its purpose to benefit the country. So on your tables, you'll see a document like this. And this document is a takeaway pack. It basically helps you to understand the investment opportunities that the private sector can access in the context of the Big Four. I'll try very hard not to, is this the clicker? Or which one? This one. So I'll try very hard not to repeat what you already know, so that I can use the 15 or so minutes I have really discussing what government's perspective of shared value is in the context of the Big Four. So now the magic button. We have a budget of about 2.7 trillion shillings. If you net off wage bills, which come to about 670 billion shillings across both national and county governments, you are left with development and recurrent expenditure roughly at about 1.5 to 2 billion, to 2 trillion shillings every year. Now, governments exist. The raison d'etre for government is to serve its people and to help them to achieve prosperity at communal and at individual level. This work cannot be done by government alone. It must be done through various actors: business community, non-state actors, the civil society, religious organizations, community-based outfits that really serve to connect government services to the people at the lowest denomination of governance. When we look at the Big Four in terms of its aspirations, what immediately jumps out is the fact that this aspiration, if you were to cost it, runs into trillions of shillings. But this aspiration is not one where the government is going to remove money from its pocket to pay for. It's going to create the correct environment, the policy environment, to create a regime in which these three actors working closely together in concert can then achieve this vision of ours called the Big Four. So we have a youth problem. The median age in Kenya is 19 and a half years, sorry. Money on my mind, money on my mind. 19 and a half years. And perhaps on the continent, we have the most connected youth in terms of their access to information. So they know what is going on across the world. They know when they're getting a raw deal. And more importantly, they know what a prosperous future looks like because they can see it. What frustrates a lot of young people is that they don't feel that this prosperity is coming to them soon enough. And this is the challenge that governments have to deal with. In a democratic environment where governments change every 5 years, administrations change every 5 years, you have to remain conscious that the voting population continues to get younger and younger. And their needs are changing dramatically. Which is why when we conceptualized the Big Four, it really was based on what we call a national household survey. And the 4 things that came out, one, of course, is our young people would like jobs, wherever those jobs will come from, because they want to earn a livelihood in a dignified environment. Number 2 is food is expensive in Kenya. If I was to take a comparison, just on a desktop evaluation, if you're to buy a chicken, a whole chicken, Roadrunner, many of you knows what the Roadrunner is. In Kenya, on average, it will cost you about 800 shillings. In Mozambique, it will cost you 200 shillings. Now, when your disposable income becomes extremely tied to, number 1, the need to feed yourself and your family. Number 2, the ability for you to treat and medicate and have a healthy household. Number 3 is to be able to put a roof over your head in a healthy and respectable way, and space. These three things are factual. Whenever anyone asks about how did you decide which of the big four, which of these pillars you'd settle on, those three issues underpin the real situation in the country. We spend too much money out of pocket for healthcare. We spend too much money on food and don't get value for it at the cost that we pay. And number three is that most people would prefer to live in better environment. So if you were renting a home, you would want to get value for money for what you're paying. If you wanted to build your home, you would want not to bankrupt yourself in the process. Number three, if you want to live somewhere, you would want access to clean water, sanitation, security, and all the amenities that attach thereto. And this is how we came up with these priorities as opposed to other priorities. Now, immediately, you can see even from the information pack that I've shared, is that there is huge opportunity for private sector to play a critical part. And just framing everybody's role within the shared value prism, or looking at it through that perspective, I've just done a small graphic to indicate the role of business vis-a-vis the role of government. And at the very beginning, you'll be able to determine that business actually and non-state actors are the most critical component of the big four. For instance, when we look at education, education in part is delivered by government by preparing the curriculum, looking at the welfare of teachers, but the biggest disconnect today we have, primarily from the corporate sector, is that the product of our educational institutions is not fit for purpose. So a lot of panel beating needs to happen after university or after some form of tertiary education. And you find that the private sector has to take a lead in developing curricula that are more suitable for their business aspirations. A case in point would be some of the large infrastructure programs that are being carried out across the country. One of my pet peeves has always been the inability, when you walk through a construction site, there are no straight lines. If you carry a spirit level or a tape measure, you are guaranteed to find poor quality work even in the most sophisticated of buildings, because we lost a huge component of our blue-collar trainees, because somehow we managed to convince our young people that the only pathway to prosperity was university. So we saw a multiplication in the number of universities offering courses that are very bizarre. I think our Cabinet Secretary for Education may have said this in other fora, but one of the most popular courses in Kenya is supply chain management. And no guessing why. Everyone wants to make a procurement decision, and not because they have any expertise of some sort, but it's because they feel that that is the easiest way for them to land resources into their own pockets. So there is some space to do. We need to change our approach to tertiary education to make these people more suitable either to be entrepreneurs in and of themselves or to be fit for purpose for the new generation of industries that are coming through and have the potential to create jobs for our young people. Secondly, is just looking at where do the opportunities lie. So yesterday, His Excellency the President went to tour one of our anchor housing programs in Ngara, what we call the Park Road development. In that development, you have already 600 people employed as builders, masons, carpenters, general laborers, glaziers, electricians, and all manner of practical, technical, vocational skills. But the reality is we don't have enough of those people. If we were to widen the scale for housing based on our aspiration today, there will be a huge shortage of these specialists. And it's why we have indicated as a key enabler within the Big Four, the need to really relook at our technical and vocational training. For us to be able to say that vocational training is cool. It's cool because as soon as you finish that course, you are guaranteed a job. You are guaranteed a legitimate source of income and one that allows you to contribute to the economy. We also look at where do the opportunities lie for private sector in all of these environments. And again, if I refer you back to that, the chart on the screen, you'll see that for government, it's really about creating the correct ecosystem. Creating the correct ecosystem for knowledge sharing, for infrastructure improvement, for taxes and taxation to give the appropriate and correct incentives to business, looking at the role of law and order and access to justice, because that's a key enabler for business. And lastly, looking just at the entire ecosystem, policy ecosystem, that will enable business to operate in a predictable way and make longer-term decisions. Now, I don't want to read this slide for slide. I will take it as a given that everyone understands the opportunities that exist. My real message today is what I'll jump to, which is what will stop us from achieving shared value in the context of the Big Four. So we are going to do 500,000, create 500,000 new homeowners. In the last 6 months, what have I witnessed from private sector? At least 50% of the people who have engaged us on housing are more interested in making a quick buck and a killing. They are not interested in the objective of providing dignified homes to Kenyan citizens. And that's a problem that resides largely, if I was to draw a line in the room, on that side, where you are. Because people are happy as businessmen to look at the bottom line without necessarily thinking about the ethical challenges that they must address. So I'll ask you, if there is no willingness to share the cake, can we really achieve shared value? So an example would be in the coffee space. For every 100 shillings that a coffee farmer, worth of coffee that a farmer would produce, our farmers here would typically get between 14 and 20 shillings. And that's not a problem of government. That's a problem largely of the private sector. Because today, premium coffee from Kirinyaga County, I'll give you an example, would be sold at almost 800 shillings per kilo. The farmer in Kirinyaga will get less than 100 shillings. The coffee sector has been built on smallholder farms with volunteer workers, mostly children and women who go in to pick coffee berries. The profits made at the apex of coffee trading don't seem to appreciate that in a country like Kenya that produces one of the best quality coffees, both for blending and for direct consumption, is that the coffee sector will die. It will die because there refuses to be an acceptance that the farmers must get better value for their coffee, for them to stop cutting their trees down to build empty, big residential estates that are empty. And many of you have driven on the metropolitan side of Nairobi, where you go into Limuru and parts of Kiambu, which were under tea and coffee, and now they're huge housing estates, maybe 20% uptake in those housing estates. But we have put entire generations out of business. We have turned our farmers into speculators for land. And the reason for this is because we refuse to share value. So for me, that would be challenge number one. The people who mill are private. The people who export are private. The people who do the last value addition for coffee and retail it are private sector. How is it possible that they can continue to profit without passing these benefits down the food chain? Something will give. And I refer you back to my opening statement. 19 and a half years is the average age of your population. If you cannot convince these children to go and take up agriculture and food production, they won't do it because there's no money. They're not fools. They're not going to go spend time in a farm if they don't see compensation coming through at a proportionate value. So what happens to that entire food chain? Coffee starts to diminish, quality starts to disappear, and the guy at the apex eventually becomes an endangered species because they have profited without looking at the entire value chain. And this works across different spectra. I can say the same thing for potatoes. I can say the same thing for horticulture and what we call business cash crops. The farmer gets the short end of the stick. In fact, the average daily income, household income for farmers is 600 shillings. Why would this person spend so much energy doing this farming if they cannot see corresponding value coming to it? And for a country that 27% of its GDP comes from agriculture, this is a real and present danger. Number two, is the business community willing to rethink their approach to intellectual property rights? And where does this come in? Many of you might be privy to a conversation that's been happening in the United States Senate about the role of innovation. And specifically here, a drug for the treatment of HIV called Truvada, where a month's course of treatment on average is $2,000 in the United States. Across the globe in Australia, the same drug is sold at $8. It's inconceivable that a company would want to profit on an issue such as this. Where we sit in government, it becomes a bigger and bigger concern because if we're looking at healthcare and giving universal coverage to over 50 million Kenyans, then we must look at the entire chain of the health provision, from the infrastructure to the drugs. The cost of drugs in Kenya is absolutely off kilter. It's something that is so worrying that you find in every homestead, on average, for every 1,000 shillings, over 260 shillings is spent out of pocket for health-related expenditure. Most of this is paying too much for drugs, and we're still paying too much for drugs that in most instances are counterfeit. So when you try to explain to an ordinary person that you would want them to have good quality health care, they can't relate because their reality every day is that they are paying for the price for intellectual property because that's the justification that is used. Now, the raison d'etre for government I mentioned at the beginning is to serve its people. So the government cannot continue to watch key commodities continuing to be overpriced on such essential social services. And rather than have an antagonistic and adversarial relationship with the business community, it's better now, within the framework of shared value, that businesses start to take longer-term positions. It will cost you nothing by selling these drugs at a more affordable cost because the government can guarantee you a supply chain. We can guarantee you patience. We can ensure that your drug is purchased and that we can deal with counterfeiters. But the unwillingness to compromise on this is actually what has led to the increase in counterfeits. Because if, for example, a round of chemotherapy can run into hundreds of thousands of shillings every month, and the cost of that drug is 90% IP, 1% ingredients, that is not sustainable. And even if it's not now, inevitably people will fight, there will be conflict, and governments will have to take populist positions, including even what is being discussed in the US Senate about drug price controls. Because the people must be healthy. A government can be removed on the basis of inability to provide access to affordable health care. So something I would want you to reflect on. Lastly, and Bob mentioned this in his address, is the willingness to accept that 50% of the problem in corruption in Kenya and in Africa is sitting again on that side of the room. The KRA officers who are now being interdicted are being interdicted because they received bribes to massage taxation figures, but they didn't bribe themselves. I don't know, how many of you think they bribed themselves? Everyone is in a panic right now because in the new legal regime that allows for plea bargaining, we expect the KRA officers to throw quite a number of people under the bus. Most of those people, again, will be sitting on that side of the room. So when we talk about the willingness to confront corruption in the context of shared value, is that if we are unable to have a grown-up discourse about the role of the private sector, the role of non-state actors in aiding and abetting corrupt and unethical practices, then it is impossible for the government to unilaterally deal with official graft. And it's important that I pass on this message because there is a lot of pressure on this administration to crack the whip on corruption based on sentiment. We have to be careful not to allow the war on corruption to become a McCarthyism situation, which is built on witch hunting. Evidence-based prosecutions must lead the way. We must give room to law and order to take precedence in this war on corruption. But the private sector must acknowledge that they cannot survive, this country cannot survive until you say enough is enough. And I would find it very difficult for us to achieve shared value unless we can confront in an honest way these three challenges. One, to be able to take a longer-term view. Make investments that last, not short-term exploitation of people and citizens and customers. Number two, particularly in the healthcare space and the agriculture space, let's deal with the question of IPR from a social benefit perspective. Because at the end of the day, there is no point in selling a drug to people who can't afford to pay it. Number three, as I close, would really be the question of corruption. This discussion is so hot because it involves so much emotion. People can see when there is pressure, particularly on businesses to pay taxes. There is pressure on individuals to comply with the law. So it's not hard to understand where the frustrations come from when people feel that the war against corruption is not moving at the pace that it ought to move. But I would like to give you comfort that, number one, is that the rule of law will prevail. Number two, that the business community, in order to achieve genuine shared value on the Big Four programs, must abandon unethical business practices and must not be part of the problem on corruption. I can write a book about government tendering processes and how the phone calls come to government officials from that side of the room, where they would want to see government policies tailored not for the benefit of the majority, but for the benefit of individual organizations, so that they might profit ahead of their competition. I don't think it's sustainable, and I don't think it will help us achieve shared value across the board if we are not able to confront these issues. I thank you very much for listening. I will stay here for most of the morning, and if anyone would want to discuss this on a one-to-one basis, I will be at your disposal. Thank you very much.
I did not get up because his time was up. It's because I felt sufficiently chastised as one of the people sitting on that side of the room to remove myself and come and stand here. So I need you to go back to Twitter. Our hashtag is ASVS19, so that you can correct anything that might be said by others. Because, Waita, you do know that, procurement management gets a bad rep from Waita, might become a tweet. And that's not what you said at all. Waita takes war on corruption to the private sector. That might become a tweet. But the good thing is, we have a media partner here today, the Nation Media Group, and NTV is actually not just a partner, but is live streaming this, so Waita, you will not be misquoted. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to actually get into the how, but also the why of shared value. Our next speaker is a gentleman whose name is synonymous with President Kramer Capital, Associate Ropes and Gray. He's an economist, but it also only makes sense that he would be a shared value pioneer. He says the idea of shared value says we can and we must build social and environmental issues into the strategies of our companies. The question for many of us in this room is how? And also, let's be honest, why? Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together, sit back, and let's get this part of the conversation going with Mark Kramer.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It is wonderful to be here, to follow such august speakers, and to be able to be back in Kenya again. I say to be able to be back because the last time I was in Kenya a few years ago, I was working with the Conrad Hilton Foundation on their philanthropy program to help orphans with AIDS or whose family members had died of AIDS. And we were working in rural villages, and we went out to a village near Lake Victoria, and we were staying in some nice tents. And my colleagues were having dinner, and I had to go be on a video conference in my tent. And when I came out, I'd been staring at the screen. It was dark. I couldn't see very well. But nobody was left at dinner. And I saw that all of my colleagues were standing on a hill about 100 yards away. And they started waving. And so I waved back. And then they started going like this. And I couldn't figure out what was going on, and I turned around, and about 4 feet away was a very large hippopotamus. Now, we all have different skill sets. I'm really good at PowerPoint. I'm thinking that's not going to help me now. Fortunately, I did not know how dangerous hippopotamuses can be, how fast they can run, how they can break your body in half with a single bite. So I didn't panic, and fortunately the hippopotamus went his way and I went mine, and I'm now able to be back here. So I'm very grateful for that. But what I want to talk to you about this morning is this idea of creating shared value. And I think it's a very powerful idea, and it's very gratifying that people here and all over the world are talking about this idea. But I have to tell you honestly, most people don't understand it. Most people think that when we talk about creating shared value, we're talking about shared values, the personal values that we might have as business leaders or as community members or as government members. And that's not what we mean. Other people think we're talking about sharing the value that has already been created in terms of more philanthropy or taking less profit. But that's not what we mean either. And other people think this is just the new fancier word for CSR, corporate social responsibility, or for philanthropy. But that's not it either. What we're really talking about is how to create value for society by simultaneously creating value for business. And Carolyn and some of the previous speakers already did some of my work for me by talking about shared value as an aspect of competitive strategy. And let me talk for a moment about what that really means and try and channel Professor Michael Porter, my colleague, if I can, who is known around the world for his work on strategy. As Carolyn said, you know, there are a lot of companies who say our strategy is to be the best. But there is no best because there are many different kinds of customers, and each customer has a somewhat different set of needs. And if you try and serve everybody, you'll have a very mediocre product. And if you try and compete with others in your industry by offering the same product or service, not doing anything differently, all you can do is compete on price by trying to lower your price. And then your competitor will lower his price. And maybe you can squeeze your employees' wages, or you can take other shortcuts, or you can call up a minister and offer a bribe, as was described. But those are not sustainable competitive advantages. A really sustainable competitive advantage comes from picking the particular customer segment you want to serve and designing every activity in your organization to serve their needs better than anyone else. And if you do that, you can have a sustainable competitive advantage that creates greater profit. Because your competitor, who's trying to serve other people, will have to make trade-offs, will have to give up some of what he's doing to serve other people if he's trying to compete with you. And so this idea that doing something different from others, finding a different market to serve, a different need to meet, is the essence of sustainable competitive advantage. Now, how does that relate to social issues, to environmental issues? Well, it turns out that most businesses operate on business models that were developed decades or centuries ago. The idea of banking arose hundreds of years ago in Italy to serve merchants, and then was expanded in the UK. But it was always about serving the affluent and serving big customers. And every aspect of banking was designed that way. And you can look at industry after industry after industry, and every one of them was designed to serve well-off people in developed markets. And those models don't work for most of the world's population. Those models don't work if we want to try and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Those models don't work if we want to reduce carbon emissions and have a better environment. because nobody thought about those issues when they designed those business models. And what Professor Porter and I have tried to focus on is this idea that addressing social needs, taking into account environmental impact, helping to achieve sustainable development goals, offer whole new areas of differentiation for companies, whole new business models that can achieve superior profitability, whole new avenues for competitive strategy. And so we believe that there is a synergy between greater opportunity for business and greater opportunity for society. That so much of what we see as social and environmental problems are actually the most promising business opportunities we have in the coming decades. Now, it seems obvious and simple to say this, but as we talk to different companies and work with different companies around the world, we find that there is this deep divide between the social sector and the business sector. And each sector thinks the other one is the problem. And if people are talking about doing good, solving a social problem, they feel they shouldn't be making money. They should be doing it for charity, out of the goodness of their heart. And if someone is trying to build a profitable business, he shouldn't be worrying about social impact and social problems. That's up to government and the social sector. But the reality is that that division is false. And that division is holding us back from achieving the kind of progress we can achieve, both in business and in society. What are some examples? Well, I talked about banking being developed for the affluent in developed markets, that's the model of that business. But M-Pesa, as Safaricom, is one of the world's best examples of creating shared value. It's not a charitable effort. It is rethinking financial services for much of the world's population that has no access to traditional banking, no need for traditional banking products, but can absolutely benefit from access to savings and credit. It can improve their lives and the lives of their families by having access to financial services. And it is a tremendously successful and profitable business that has really transformed much of the economy of this country for the better. And that ability to achieve scale is perhaps the greatest virtue of engaging business in solving social problems. Because when we try and help through philanthropy, we can help. But it turns out there's very few dollars. And so we can help only a few people. But if there is a solution to a social problem that is actually profitable, we can scale it up in a way that no philanthropy can. And we can build in innovation, we can take risk, we can drive efficiency in a way that typically governments around the world and nonprofits are not able to do. I'll give you a quick example. Nizioka talked about education and the importance of education. Well, we had the global shared value event just a few weeks ago in the US, and one of our speakers was a businessman from Peru, Carlos Rodriguez Pastor. And his company is called Intercorp. And he operates a number of different businesses, all of which are aimed at serving the emerging middle class in Peru. But he recognized that the educational system in Peru was terrible. It was toward the bottom of the world's educational systems. And there were private schools, but they were too expensive, and frankly, they weren't that good either. Now, he could have said, well, I'm going to address this problem through philanthropy. But instead, he said, I want to make this a business. And so he went around the world to study what are the best secondary educational schools. And he worked with world-class experts to design the Innova school system that was designed just for the needs of Peruvians, and designed in a way that helped the students learn what they needed to get the jobs that were available in Peru. He set up these schools. They're private schools. They cost about $100 a month, which most Peruvians can afford. And there are also scholarships for students who can't afford them. And the results of these schools has been phenomenal. They're in the top 25% of schools in the world. They're graduates from these poor, underprivileged backgrounds, in many cases on scholarship, can end up going to Oxford or Stanford or other outstanding universities. And the schools are profitable. He started with one school. It worked very well. It took about 2 or 3 years to achieve a profit, but it was able to achieve about a 20% profit. Very attractive. And as a result, he was able to open more schools. And today, there are 40,000 kids in Peru in these schools. Next year, there will be 100,000. And he doesn't have to stop there, because it is a profitable business model. He can access the capital and the talent he needs to grow it, and his ambition is nothing less than to create the school system for the country of Peru, and therefore advance the livelihoods and opportunity for Peruvians. So this is the power of engaging business in solving social problems by developing new business models that create a competitive advantage, that create value for the company, but also create value for society. And by looking around like M-Pesa and finding new business models that meet the needs of most of the world's population. You know, there's another simple example I love. I wear glasses. When I need a prescription, I go to an optometrist to get it. Well, most of the world has no access to an optometrist. And a very bright young social entrepreneur said, you know, if I have 2 lenses and they're mirror opposites of each other, and I put them together and align them perfectly, they're clear, there's no distortion. But if I begin to slide them apart, you actually get a stronger and stronger prescription. So I can make eyeglasses with double lenses and a little dial on the side. You don't need an optometrist. You just put the glasses on and turn the dial until you can see. Well, there are about 1 billion people in the world who need eyeglasses. And if you can't see, you can't work. And this simple invention is bringing better eyesight to millions of people, increasing their incomes by an average of 20%. And again, it can scale to the size of the world because it is a profitable business model. So when we talk about this idea of creating shared value, we think of it as happening at 3 levels. The first level is around developing new products or entering new markets and finding new ways to serve them, like M-Pesa or like the eyeglass company Vision Spring. The second level is to rethink the activities in your value chain, the activities within your organization, to think about how you can create a more inclusive business, to how you can operate your business more profitably and more efficiently by having a healthier, more productive workforce, and by taking into account the environmental and social impacts of your activities. And it turns out that when you begin to think about that second level, you begin to think about your suppliers and your customers as well, and what you can do to help them. And there's a very interesting example in Latin America where Saab Miller, a beer company that sells much of its beer in Latin America through very small kiosks and mom-and-pop shops that operate, realized that those mom-and-pop shops were really struggling. They weren't earning a very good living. They were in danger of going out of business. And they weren't selling a whole lot of beer. And so they developed a corps of consultants that Saab Miller paid for to go out into communities and to teach retailing skills to these mom-and-pop stores, to help them understand their costs, their inventory control, to improve how they did lighting and arrange their displays and so on. And the result is a 50% increase in income for the families operating these stores, and correspondingly, a 30% increase in the sale of beer. It's created value for SAB Miller, and it's created value for the families that operate these kiosks around the countries. So thinking about how to not just accept the world as it is, with all of the limitations on your business because of poorly educated employees, because of inadequate health care, because of environmental impact, but instead to say, we can actually solve some of those problems, and if we can solve them, we'll improve the performance for our own company, our own shareholders, at the same time as we help society. You know, I love what Nizioka said about a fair profit and about not extorting too much profit. And certainly, it's hard to disagree that many pharmaceutical products are way overpriced, and unconscionably so. But I'll tell you, when I go to a business leader other than Bob, and say, you know, you ought to make less money, that conversation doesn't go very well. And even the most well-meaning CEO will tell me about the pressure he is under from his shareholders to meet those quarterly performance numbers, to sell more, to have higher profit than he had the year before. And it would be nice if he had a broader social vision, if every CEO of a major company was like Bob Collymore, I'd be out of a job. But we have to deal with the realities of business. And we have to recognize that if we want business to change, we have to show business why it is in their interest to change. And that is the power of shared value. So I mentioned that we think about shared value operating at 3 levels. The first is new products and markets. The second is rethinking the activities in your value chain and your suppliers and your customers. The third level is really about strengthening the communities that you're a part of. Because if your employees and customers are struggling, it's going to hold you back as a business. And I love the example Nizioka talked about in terms of coffee growers. And it reminded me of one of the cases I teach at Harvard Business School, which is on a Norwegian fertilizer company called Yara. It's a global fertilizer company, and it has made a specialty of working with smallholder farmers, color-coding the different types of fertilizers so that even an illiterate farmer can understand which one works best for him, and providing all kinds of advice and technical support out in the field to help farmers use fertilizer better. And they were selling in Africa. They had a port of entry in Tanzania, but it was actually their worst performing market. And there were a lot of reasons for that. One, as we heard about, was corruption. The port was very corrupt. It took 6 months to get something out of the port if you didn't pay people off. But once you got it out of the port, there were no good roads to get out to the smallholder farmers in rural Tanzania. And even if you got to them, they had no access to financing or credit or money to buy fertilizer at the time that they needed it. And even if they bought fertilizer, they weren't very knowledgeable about how to use it well. And even if they were knowledgeable about how to use it well, there was no power, and therefore there was no irrigation, and you couldn't grow crops very well in this region without irrigation. And on and on and on. And of course, billions of dollars in international aid and philanthropy had gone in to try and solve these problems. And every one of those efforts did some good, but the problem was that every philanthropist, every international development agency focused on just one little piece of the problem. The World Bank would build a road, and that's great, but that didn't help the farmer unless he had irrigation. The Gates Foundation might come in and teach farmers better farming techniques, but unless the farmer had access to credit, he couldn't get better agricultural inputs. We live in a world where tremendous amounts of philanthropy and government aid are targeted on individual slivers of the complex, interrelated social problems we face. And if we can't tackle all aspects of the problem at once, we don't actually solve it. So Yara said, you know, this could be a good market for us, but there are all these obstacles, and we can't solve this alone. We can't fix it. But we also can't wait for government. Government has its own priorities, and listening to the needs of very poor smallholder farmers in rural areas was not a high priority for government. But what Yara did is they brought together all of the different players who touched on this issue. 70 different private sector companies that each had an interest in agricultural development. Certainly the government and the Minister of Agriculture of Tanzania, certainly the World Bank and charitable foundations. And they got them all together and said, let's figure out what do we need to do to create a successful agricultural cluster for smallholder farmers in Tanzania? And let's figure out what sequence we have to do things in. Right? There's no point trying to put in irrigation until we've got power, etc. And so together, this group came up with a coherent plan for how to address all of the needs that were holding farmers back. It was a 2-decade-long plan, many billions of dollars. Yara put on only a small amount, 60 million, a very small amount of the many billions. But their real role was in leadership, in bringing the players together to help them develop a solution. And Yara couldn't lead this because if it was seen as a Yara initiative, the other companies wouldn't want to be part of it. The government wouldn't trust it. So they had to play a very unusual role for a company in bringing people together to collectively develop a solution without imposing their own agenda on it. But the result was there has been considerable success, even in 5 years. Farmer incomes are up by as much as 90%. And Yara has been rewarded too. Their sales of fertilizer in Tanzania have doubled. This went from being one of their worst performing markets to being one of their best. And it has created shared value. And the lesson, of course, is that companies cannot create shared value alone. If you're developing a new product, if you're developing a new model of banking, like M-Pesa, yes, you can do that. But to really solve many of the social problems that are holding our communities and our countries back, you need to work together with NGOs and the social sector. You need to work together with government. Each has a different role that they can play. But it can be done in a way that serves the interest of business in creating greater profit. And by doing so, justifies the business investment and creates this opportunity for scale and growth. It seems like a very simple idea. And yet it really does require fundamentally rethinking our business models as companies. To say, where are the social issues that hold our business back? Where are the opportunities to reinvent a model to serve the world's population that we have ignored historically? And it turns out to be quite a challenge to get companies to think differently and to think that way. But it also turns out to be tremendously rewarding opportunity. You know, I love the priorities in Kenya of the Big Four that we just heard about. They're exactly right. In each of them, I believe there are shared value strategies that can enable the private sector to turbocharge the initiatives of government and to really create solutions. I'll give you one quick example. In India, the problem of affordable housing is a huge problem as well. Millions of people keep coming into the city every year, the major cities. They end up in slums. They can't afford housing. And of course, nobody really designed housing for low-income people. Developers build expensive housing because they'll make the most money that way. But an organization in India decided to develop really inexpensive housing apartments that could be sold for a few $1,000s, but were nice apartments. It was very complicated. They had to work with architects and designers to come up with the models. They had to get variances in zoning because what they were trying to do wasn't officially permitted by government. And then they had to develop, they found a microfinance mortgage market because even borrowing a few $1,000s, particularly for people who were in the informal economy, there was no vehicle to finance that. So they had to put all of these different pieces together, but the result now is 80,000 housing units and many more under construction. Because they are profitable, developers are finding that the demand for this is so great that people are willing to put the money up front before the building's even built, so the developer doesn't even need financing. It's turned out to be a tremendous business model. Just one more example of creating shared value. And I believe whether you're sitting here in business or from government or from civil society, there are opportunities to break down this division between business and society, to find profitable business opportunities, to support those and enhance those through philanthropic efforts, through the work of the social sector, through the work of government. Each of us, I believe, has a role to play in creating shared value. And if we begin to think this way, to uncover these opportunities, I think we will begin to see development activity and human progress and environmental progress, not just in Kenya, but across Africa and across the world. And doing that turns out to make every job much more fulfilling. When you know that the work you are doing is helping others, is making the world a better place, that is one powerful reward. Thank you very much for letting me be with you today, and I look forward to the rest of the conference.
I want to see the ladies lose control. So turn around, give it to me, baby, passionately.
Wow. A round of applause, please, for Mark Kramer. I am going to work really hard. I'm going to ask the next set of speakers to work with me. I'm going to make up for lost time so that we're able to make it in time for lunch. I'm going to pick up from where Mark left off about value. Our next speaker is a gentleman who says this often when he speaks, that the money he makes should be equal to the value he brings to others. This is a gentleman who's very clear that he joined the pharmaceutical industry not because he loved it, but because he hated it. He shall explain. You and I know that as Kenyans, as Africans, we know that we are one critical illness away from poverty. And Whiter spoke about literally making